DAM has long been a platform for Indigenous voices to lead conversations on critical topics, from the history of collecting to the global work of contemporary artists today. This symposium is a moment of deep reflection and a forward-looking commitment to our shared future. We are dedicated to ensuring the Denver Art Museum remains a place where Indigenous arts and voices are not only seen and heard, but are centered and celebrated for generations to come. As an institution, and this is something you may not hear as much anymore, but this is something we live and truly believe, that the Denver Art Museum is both a platform for and an amplifier of the voices of people of all races. We acknowledge that communities have been underrepresented in art museums over decades, both internally and externally. We are committed to elevating all voices, artworks, and perspectives, and strive to support inclusivity and belonging inside and out. Today, we gather on the homeland of the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Ute people, along with people from many other Indigenous nations that call this place home. Museums have benefited from the displacement of Indigenous people and the removal and historical misrepresentation of their arts, often resulting in deep harm to originating communities. While we cannot change the past, we can change how we move forward. Indigenous people have made substantial impacts to our institution, and our identity is innately tied to Native histories and the contributions of Indigenous people, past and present. This inspires and grounds us as we move forward in a better way. With this, we at Denver Art Museum commit to building authentic and sustained relationships with Indigenous people at multiple touchpoints across our institution. Centering, elevating, and supporting Indigenous people in our programs and practices, and providing meaningful access to our resources, including collections, programs, tools, and spaces. And of course, actively listening to and integrating Indigenous voices to grow as an inclusive and accessible space. Throughout the symposium, discussions in the various panels will cover a range of topics, including the history and future of Indigenous art collecting, the evolution of the DAM's commitment to Indigenous communities, and the global work of contemporary Indigenous artists. The symposium will also delve into themes of collaboration, relationship building, community engagement, elevating Indigenous voices in global artistic conversations, as well as changing curatorial practice to increase Indigenous representations in museum collections. We at the Denver Art Museum offer our deep gratitude for those who have supported this event, especially the Terra Foundation for American Art and the residents who support the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, SCFD, which will be coming up for renewal in a few years. So for those of you who are local, I'm telling you now, vote yes on that one when it comes up. It's not on this ballot, but it's coming in the future again. And those who are from out of town may not know this, but this Scientific and Cultural Facilities District is a 7-county collaborative tax district so it's 1/10 of 1%, so a penny for every $10 that is spent goes into a fund that supports over 300 cultural and scientific organizations in the larger metro area in the 7-county region. And we get, I think, about 20 to 25% of our budget from this tax district. So it's a really incredible public-private partnership that really supports the arts and culture here. At this time, I don't want to take up any more time of my own, so I want to introduce our keynote speaker. I'd like to welcome Wayne Modest, who's the Director of Content and Head of the Research Center for Material Culture at the Wereld Museum. I hope my Dutch is, did I get that right? No? Didn't think so. Oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah. Which is formerly the National Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands. A cultural studies scholar by training, Wayne works at the intersection of material culture, memory, and heritage studies with a strong focus on colonialism and its afterlives in Europe and the Caribbean. He has published widely and is currently working on several publication projects, including Museum Temporalities and Curating the Colonial. Wayne has co-curated several exhibitions, most recently the Kingston Biennial in 2022, entitled Pressure, and the exhibition What We Forget in 2019, an exhibition that challenged dominant forgetful representations of Europe that erased the role of Europe's colonial past in shaping our contemporary world. With that, I'd like to welcome Wayne Modest.
Normally, I have a little zapper, and that zapper gets rid of all of the empty chairs so that everybody comes closer. But I forgot it on the plane, so we don't have that today. I'd like to thank you all for inviting me. I'd like to thank Caitlin, John, and all of the team here for your patience, but also for the warmth and kindness with which you've invited me, and the hotel is wonderful. And I'd like to also first thank you for coming, but also apologize. When John and Caitlin invited me, I asked, why me? Because in a certain sense, my engagement with or intellectual interest in the question of indigeneity is more recent. For a long time, I've worked on the Caribbean, and especially on the question of slavery and colonialism, or on the question of how Europe got objects, so the Europe museum infrastructure. More recently, though, I've been interested in a set of questions that hover around the question of the indigeneity, and some of these are what is going to come up today. The question of the indigenous for me, and I'll just say that I might say a lot of things, but at the end of all of this, my core question that will animate today, or two core questions, is what might it mean for us in Europe and in European museum to engage with indigenous communities? What is that distance? What does that distance do? And my second question, and more importantly, is the question of, I'm actually playing with your title about move. And what does it mean to be moved? I'm interested in that question of being moved. In a 2018 workshop, oh, by the way, I write my presentations and then I forget to read them. So it's going to be a little bit of chaos, but it will happen. In a 2018 workshop in Amsterdam, which I co-organized, entitled Law, Justice, and the Colonial Archive, Professor of International Relations and Law at Cornell University, Siva Gravoku, made what could be regarded today as a remarkable, even an unlikely claim. Responding to the question of what should be done with objects acquired by museums in Europe during the colonial period, whether they should be returned to the countries of origin or remain in European museum, Siva remarked, and I paraphrase him here, I would be okay, he says, if some of these objects were to remain in Europe. What concerns me more is not that they are here in Europe, but that these objects have never been allowed to move us, to move Europe and Europeans. Rather, they have been conscripted into a narrative that would sustain ideas of Europe's superiority. As many of you would know, even if the question of restitution of the artists from across the world has been raging for some time now, in fact, for almost a century, some would say, because at the moment of Indonesia taking its sovereignty in 1945, at that moment, they already asked for objects to be returned to Indonesia. So even if it has been raging for some time now, by the middle of the second decade of the 21st century, so in 2014-15, these discussions would reach its highest in recent years. It was in 2017, I think, for example, when French President Emmanuel Macron would announce what would become a major shift in European museum policy in relationship to restitution. In a public presentation in Ouagadougou, Macron would conclude that at present, over or about 90% of Africa's cultural heritage are now in European collections. Moreover, in that presentation, he promised that this would change. Macron commissioned a report that Felwine Sarr and Benedicte Savoy did, and that would have shifted a lot what is happening in Europe now, in some sense, about how museums think about restitution. Macron's announcement would be significant, with its ripple effects across Europe and even across the world. Indeed, since 2018, restitution has moved from the backdrop in discussions around ethnographic museums to being a pressing matter in popular and political discussions across Europe today. I will tell you all of the stories, so anybody who is on the live stream, don't tell anybody, it's a secret, but I was in Indonesia on a restitution travel trip to discuss possible restitution, and one of the politicians says any director of any museum who does restitution will go to prison. So it is a part of political discussions within Europe, and we know what is happening in the UK. And while I've highlighted Macron's role here, it cannot be credited to him, and the shift that we've seen is not about Macron. Indeed, his was only part of a growing activist unrest demanding that museums across Europe address their colonial past or their colonial present, with restitution being a key factor in these debates. I've spoken and written on a number of occasions on restitution and the question of historical reckoning, and I'm now concluding a major project on this topic. And I wanted to just show you an image. That image on the right is of an activist of Congolese descent who went into one of our museums, the museums owned by the fathers, and he walked in and he picked up that sculpture, and in a poetic act of activism, he walked out of the museum with the sculpture. It took him about 25 minutes to do that. It was a performance. It was a performance when Mwazulu Diabanza was saying to us at the museum, who is the thief? Is it possible for you to call me a thief when it belongs to my community? Or is it the museum that is the thief? Today, however, I'm interested not so much in the question of restitution or how restitution can help us to understand questions of indigenous art and art practices, but rather I want to look at the question that Gravoni proposed to us. Going back to my opening point, what does it mean that objects move us? What does it mean that we allow, through curatorial strategy, art to move us? And what was the kind of move that Gravoni was interested in? In this presentation, then, I would like to circulate through a certain set of ideas for you, just to, in a way, engage with this idea of movement. And today, I'm interested in two ideas of movement. One is an affective idea of movement. I feel something. An object moved me to feel something. And I'll tell you a little secret that I will tell it later, but I'll say it now. When I first saw my first Vermeer, I cried. I'll tell you why I cried. So you feel something. But I'm interested more in another kind of move, which I call a tectonic move, a shaking, an ontological shift. A shift in the very conception of how we understand the world and what the world is. And my proposal here today is that as curators, we should be curating that tectonic move. So this is the kind of activist projects that I've been involved in across Europe right now. The one on top you would know that is Decolonize This Place, but they were in the Brooklyn Museum, they met other places. Rose Must Fall, which ties to in South Africa, and Fees Must Fall in South Africa, that kind of shifted to to Oxford, Rhodes Must Fall, the Humboldt Forum, and the discussions that happened there. And in the middle was a group that we started in the museum called Decolonize the Museum in 2015-16. And that was perhaps one of the most influential projects that I've done in relationship to how we attend to the question of the colonial past. It was also my early years in social media, and so we were working with young people who were very interested in everything going on social media. So at one moment when they were criticizing us, I had a one of our marketing managers wanted to set up a desk beside them, and every time they criticized, she would say, but. And we decided not to do that. And to be honest with you, that has benefited us more than had we been in that defensive position of the buts, and buts. But it is a well-known story, and that one that may not need repeating right here. For at least the 16th century, from at least the 16th century onwards, the arts of indigenous peoples traveled across many borders to find their ways in museums in Europe, but also other places across the world. In Jamaica, where I lived, where I'm from, and where I worked for a while, the National Museum traces back to 1879, when the Institute of Jamaica, was founded. Jamaica, like many places, I live now in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and I can tell you, Jamaica shares something with the Netherlands. It is an arrogant little country. It loves itself. So Jamaica, like any other small place that thinks it is supposed to be big, organized its own great exhibition in 1891. And to that exhibition, the world also came. They too hold small collections of indigenous arts. One of the questions that have animated my interest recently is not so much how we deal with those indigenous arts practices that are in European museums, but what happens when Jamaica does it. How does places that themselves were colonized and now have these collections think about the relationship between the questions of stealing and whatever? They too hold these collections then. Stolen, looted, gifted, exchanged, bartered, and purchased, acquired within scientific expeditions or accidentally through geological surveys. And I use that word accidentally very, very importantly, because in my museum, we have had people say, for example, there was a guy in the 1960s, he was in West Africa, and he said, I accidentally found these bones when I was in the desert, and I think you should have them. And that kind of accident, I don't know how it happens, but we're still dealing with his accident now because we don't know how to deal with it. And I'm going to talk about restitution more later. While within some circles, these objects are described as stolen and all stolen, I've taken a different position. And I don't necessarily always use the word nuance. I think the word nuance is a word that the powerful use. Whenever you get criticized, you say, but we need more nuance. No, I believe in more complexity than the word nuance. So while we've taken a position that it was stolen, I think we must also acknowledge that these objects were taken under conditions of violent and unequal situations that in many ways devastated the life worlds of many indigenous peoples. I believe that for us to better understand and come to terms with the colonial past and its workings, with its intellectual and practical infrastructure, and with the multiple ways in which colonialism continues to haunt our present, then we have to take seriously the different modes through which objects entered our museums. Indeed, in the project Pressing Matter, and this is not an advertisement, but if you type pressingmatter.nl, you will see that project is a €4.5 million project with 25 researchers just looking at colonial objects in museums. Pressing Matter, which I co-lead, one of the core questions we ask is what potentialities do objects hold to help us reckon more with the colonial past? What do those objects tell us about the question of race, racial categories, about the question of the unequal distribution of resources, about how past inequalities continue to inform the present? For example, we are interested through objects to respond to the common response that you hear from many curators. And I used to say it as well, it was the law at the time when we bought it, or it was ethical at the time. By taking such claim to purchase seriously, we can ask the questions about the law. Whose understanding of the law was it? What do we mean by it was the law at the time? Does, for example, the John Lockean understanding of property rights that has come to define how we define individual property today hold if we are to take the Jamaican idea of ownership, Maroon idea of ownership differently? For the Maroons, property is common. You live on land, therefore the land belongs to you. You work land, therefore it can belong to you. If you leave that work, then we have to question whether or not it is property. So what might it mean differently if we were to take the Maroon understanding of common ownership? And later on, I'll talk about an object that I shouldn't use the word object, that we returned recently. And one of the questions that was asked about that is whether or not it was individual property to be sold in the first place. Here we draw on the work of scholars, and I'm going to be name dropping a lot, so forgive me for that, because I think citation is important, of an amazing scholar called Brenna Bandar, who wrote a brilliant book called The Colonial Lives of Property, and the work of Bernadette Ateyuna, who has this idea of dignity taking and dignity giving, and a new book that she's working on now on pillage. For me, however, I've also been interested in this from a different perspective, working through scholars such as Mark Rifkin, who some of you might know and know his work or their work, who in his book Beyond Settler Time, he's thinking about the question of legal, or I'm thinking about the question of legal temporality. So when I'm saying it was the law at the time, whose time am I talking about? And I'm interested in this idea of Mark gives this example of critiquing the Johannes Fabian's idea of co-presence, because when he says we think of co-presence, we're thinking about being present in European time. What does that do for thinking about temporal sovereignty and indigenous ways of thinking about time differently? I'm interested in whose time as well. And if I may be allowed to refer back to something you just said, John, in a certain sense, one of my critique of temporality, which I do in this book, Museum Temporalities, is that I am, from the perspective of the Caribbean, I'm putting forward an idea of what I call folded time, that past, present, and future don't exist in the same way. So when somebody says, for example, it was a long, 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 long time ago, and nobody today can be responsible for the colonial ills of the past, most activists aren't talking about the long, 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 long time ago. They're talking about the fact that that violence against indigenous peoples continue from the past into the present. So the past fold into the present, and that is what they're talking about. So how do we deal with the folding of time as in terms of violence on indigenous people? However, much has already been written, tracing the multiple ways that indigenous arts crossed borders and entered Europe. For now, in response to Seba's claim above, my interest is to highlight the ways in which these objects have been conscripted into a European historical narrative of a telling of a story of the modern, a telling of the story of the European modern and European modernism, or as Tony Bennett would describe it, in the discursive fashioning of a progressive taxonomy of the human, where some humans are regarded as more important than other humans. And this is a particularly important thing for us in my museum. And I don't know, can I call Maya out, who knows the European situation a little bit. But one of the things that has fascinated me more recently is that ethnographic museums in Europe and how the restitution debate is understood, it is a 19th century collection. They have a 19th century history, a 19th century authentic collection. And then what we do is that we jump, and I would jump, but I am afraid I will break a foot. Then we jump to the 21st century and we invite artists to come and respond to the 19th century. And within very few, if any, very few ethnographic museums, we see an engagement with a history of the 20th century. So Nick Thomas in Cambridge has an interesting collection of indigenous modernism. There is a collection at the Cabron Lee, but most ethnographic museums, it is as if the global majority had no 20th century. The 20th century belonged somewhere else in another institution. So now we are interested in a project called The History of the 20th Century, and we are working on that as to try and rethink what it might mean. So one of the projects that I'm working on, for example, is a group of artists that were in Nigeria at the moment of independence called the Oshugbo movement, and they were working together with this couple from, I think they were from Austria. But after they created the Oshugbo movement and this art practice exists, and by the way, those objects are also in Jamaica. It is fascinating. Don't know how they got there, still cannot find out, but they're also in Jamaica because in the 1970s, Jamaica, when it was trying to be independent, started to look to Africa for what independence might look like. And so they have a collection. But they moved to the Pacific, and there was a group of artists that emerged within this moment, thinking through the question of the modern. I'm interested in what it might mean to think about that. And so your museum, I'm coming to borrow as much as I can from you if you have 20th century collections that could help us think again. But another part of the question that interests me here, and I don't know if many of you are involved in the question of museology and how museums thinking, but I'm interested in the ways in which the museological narratives that we've come to tell ourselves about restitution, and later on I'm going to critique while celebrating source community work for this, has always been, for a long time, less interested in restitution and more interested in keeping. So restitution was not the goal. It was in keeping. So when we do things like object biographies, and when object biographies lack a politics of thinking about the unequal distribution of heritage value, then return is not the question. The question is to know the biography of the object so that we can keep. But my discussion this morning is not about these things, nor do I want to present a story simply of dispossession. And even while I would concur with Siba Gravoni, I want to also think about indigenous arts and borders differently through two concepts which you both know very well and which I just realized that I have missed one slide, but I will talk about it. For my part, both concepts, source community work and diaspora, take up the question of the spatial and temporal bordering, which I believe is important for your discussion today. By spatial bordering, I'm thinking about that thing about traveling to Europe. One of the things that I'm discussing now within discussions of restitution with my ministry, and we don't really think about it, I was terrified to come here. Let me just say that. If you look at my website, almost everything I say on my website means that I would be stopped at the border. So I said that to John, and I've said it to a few people. But one of the things that we haven't thought through very much when we think about restitution and its appeal towards equity is visa regimes. To be honest with you, the visa is one of the most colonial of infrastructure that continues to divide the world. And so I have tried to invite people from the Caribbean who never get to come. And then we say in our restitution policy, we're going to do research together. You come here. No, it doesn't work that way. So in a certain sense, the visa as an afterlife makes it possible that Wayne, with a Dutch passport, can put on his flip-flops and go to Indonesia without any problems. Whereas for the Indonesians to come to the Netherlands, they have to not only go through the indignity of my having to prove their humanity, but they have to go through and give all of their fingerprints, thumbprints, whatever prints, to be able to to engage with their own collections. I'm interested in a way, what might it mean that objects and our work move those kind of border infrastructure that would still create the unequal distribution of the rights to move, but even sometime of the right to life and livability. And if I can make one little other announcement, and then I'll move to my thing. I invited my niece to come and visit me in the Netherlands. She's 27, and the visa was denied. And the denial of the visa was based on the fact that they do not think she will go back. And I started to think about this. So, and this is going to be an exaggeration, forgive me. But one of the things that I thought about is that there is a presumption that there is a livability in Europe and a non-livability in Jamaica. And that she would not want to go back to that non-livability. And so, and I wonder why. And I keep saying, so my mother is American. She was American. She died. And my mother was funny. I love the woman. And I would honor her. She said she would always, I was living in New York, and she said, Wayne, I don't want to come here. It is too cold. And the Jamaican food is not as good. For my mother, livability is different. I'm interested in what might it mean that in this moment of the restitutionary, in this moment of the curatorial, we are imagining moving the goalposts so that we can imagine a little bit more equal distribution of the rights that we own. But the concept of source community has arguably been one of the most significant concepts for thinking about how indigenous peoples work with museums in Europe and in the last few decades. And I don't think I need to define it for you. I put up something here from the Decolonial Dictionary, where they says it was popularized by Pierce and Brown in their edited volume, Museum and Source Communities, and it was directly illuminates the relationship between originating communities and museums, and the term has been critiqued. And to be honest with you, I was one of the persons who critiqued the term, and I realized that Laura Pierce actually criticized my criticism. I was only 2 nights ago, while I was looking this up, I realized that she criticized my criticism. My criticism rests mainly in that on this unequal distribution and what it might mean, who gets to come, how easy it is to get to come, and how we understand that. But my criticism was also in an uneasy feeling that I've had for a long time now, where communities come from Jamaica to the Netherlands. They really want their objects back, but they don't get it. They come and they help us interpret and reinterpret the collections, and we now have up-to-date and new interpretation and exciting interpretation, and then they go home. And I've wondered what that meant about the extractive regime, that we have the objects, we have the data, and they have. Still, after my critique, I've had a change of heart. And I'll tell you about my change of heart, because I think that the idea of restitution, source community might be much more radical than I had assumed in previously. I had assumed that it was just about giving access to indigenous peoples and allowing them to be able to see collections in Europe. I had assumed that it was different here in Denver, where, as one of your colleagues was saying to me, there are many tribal communities here in Denver, and therefore access was different. But I had also falsely assumed that the water, the sea, was a barrier, because it could be so that the museum doors and curators could have been as big a barrier to indigenous peoples coming in as the wide open sea that is over there. That said, I had seen source community work as being much more impactful and productive and equitable in the US or in Canada than I had seen it in Europe. Laura Pierce would respond by saying, in 2003, when she produced Museum and Communities, The Reader, and published articles about the relationship between museum and communities that their collections came from, that she had hoped, they had hoped, it would help to strengthen the sense of responsibility between museums in the UK, at least, and mostly overseas communities whose material heritage is cared for and displayed in those museums. She says that she realized that access to these historic treasures were crucial to the questions of sustaining identities, the question that she doesn't say of indigenous sovereignties. Given the physical and political distance, she says, between museums and communities in the UK, they were concerned that museums in the UK didn't take this relationship seriously enough. But I've been wondering, what does it mean to take that relationship seriously enough? And what are the possibilities for that? She closed her one statement by suggesting that at a conference, she says, I once asked the deputy director of the British Museum whether he would understand that communities of origin might have greater need to access their material heritage than, say, London audiences. And the director at the time responded, no, that would be discriminatory. I'm cautious as to whether that is so. I think that the historic injustices of the past does place responsibilities on the present that makes the unequal distribution something that we might take seriously. In addition to that, I must say that I believe that source community work, as Laura and Alison had defined it, was instrumental in creating the conditions for the restitutionary work that we've come to see today. And that might not have happened if they didn't do that work. And it was not only them, it was taken over by many museums. We were also involved in work with Surinamese communities from Greenland, all over. And I think that that was the starting point for what we see as restitution in the way it is today. I will quickly run through this and then, John, am I okay with time? Yeah? All right, good. He's not paying attention. Because to the time. Yeah, to the time. He's not paying attention. Yeah. I will not do this as much as I did source community work, but I've been struggling with the question of diaspora for some time now and how to work with diasporic communities for many reasons. In a certain sense, there has been a lot of great theorization. James Clifford did a critical work on it. Paul Basu did an amazing article on what he called object diasporas, and what we try to do in our museum is to bring object diasporas together with people diasporas and think about those migratory flows and the ethics of what migration can do. It was a part of our work to think about the politics of belonging and how people in Europe feel that politics of belonging to the nation. And Ariel Azoulay, a wonderful theorist and scholar who is at Brown University, she has a very provocative statement in her thinking about decolonizing museums, where she says that in the middle of the so-called refugee crisis, she says that people aren't undocumented, because the collections that are in Europe are their documents. It is their right to be there as much as the objects are rightfully there. But I struggle with diaspora work because in a very difficult sense, in the restitution work that we've been doing, diaspora voices are sometimes different from voices from the community. diaspora voices actually provoke shifts and change, but in many ways, and I am, if you know Jamaica very well, I always claim my colonial condition is a British one. It's very British colonizing. And so when I'm in the Netherlands, I feel out of place, not only the language, but things are just different. But in a certain sense, one of the things about how diasporas respond is in the Maroon community, for example, in Jamaica, I realized that many of the chiefs of the Maroon communities are always Jamaicans who went away to England and came back with a particular kind of cultural capital. And therefore, I've been struggling with what that might look like and how to bring these two different voices together. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk to diaspora communities. I'm rather saying that in thinking about the work of diaspora, because in addition to source community work, I would suggest that within the context of restitution, Mwazulu Diabanza, a Congolese living in Europe, like many of the young Surinamese and Indonesian young people that I work with in the Netherlands, they have pushed the museum towards the question of decolonization in ways that would not have happened had we not listened. And they have been instrumental in the questions around restitution. So the slide that I missed, and I was talking to a wonderful person earlier, and I can't remember, about human and ancestral remains. But the slide that I missed was, we do a lot of projects with communities in the Netherlands, and this was a brilliant diasporic project, or inviting a group of young people to come and totally curate a gallery. We had curated part of the exhibition, and then we said, you can do the rest. And it's a part of what we have. We have a policy called Community Works, and we have 3 different modalities for thinking about how we work with community. One is we have an exhibition and we invite a community to work on what we define. 2 is we kind of define it together. And then there is the third one, which is frightening, where we just simply say, do what you want. We fund it, we don't criticize whatever. There was one project which they did when we opened our new fast upselling permanent exhibition called Our Colonial Inheritance, and they did a podcast. That's what they wanted to do. And it was just a podcast, a lot of it criticizing us. But it was joyous. It was just good. And I wanted to help us think with that, because I think that sometimes we as museums are so afraid of engaging in hard work. And to be honest with you, we have now been working with queer thinker Jack Halberstam's idea of failure and what we call productive failure. That as museums, failure is actually what we do best if we are good at it. Failure should be what we do best, because it means that we are willing to try to do something differently than what we continue to do over and over again. And has it worked? Sometimes I can tell you, sometimes I have so much stomach ache going home. But it is sometimes it's good to have the failure. But the reason why I wanted to raise the slide, which is not here, there was as a museum, we not only have large collections of cultural objects from indigenous peoples from across the world, we also had a lab for physical anthropology. And that means that we have in our museum around 4,000 indigenous ancestral remains that came from that history, and we have them. And one of the questions now that is a part of my research project is what do we do with these ancestral remains? So we've been involved in a lot of conversations about it. And it is also not so easy sometimes, I can tell you that. So one of the projects that we have was when an indigenous artist from Suriname, she's from the indigenous, one of the indigenous group in Suriname, and she came in a wonderful artistic singing project. She came in and she invited me to a discussion, and then she presented me with a restitution request right in the middle of the event. And since then, we've been involved in an ongoing conversation about, we have a baby in formaldehyde from this indigenous group. And a part of that is to try and understand to which group, because when we were doing physical anthropology, we were not, and that's one of the things, if you are a museologist, Tony Bennett, when I read Tony Bennett as a museologist, I always think the museum is organized and structured and whatever. And then when you work in museums, you realize, nope. A lot of things aren't really as we think they are. So the record of which indigenous group the baby came from, we don't know. We know when the baby came into the collection, but we don't know, we don't know if it was, so it is a very strange practice in the Dutch context where we used to dress up babies in fetuses in water. So they really put, what you call those, decorations on them, beaded this, and feather headdress. So this baby has a feather headdress from what we presume to be a particular group from Suriname. And she's from this group. So we've been in a 1.5-year process now of healing together with the artist, where she has been working, doing a research project in Suriname to try and work with the different groups to try and understand what we're going to do with the baby. But we also, she just presented a shrine in our museum. And the reason for the shrine was us also having to acknowledge that the one baby was not only one, but there were 26 babies in our collection. From 24 of them, I think, were from different groups in Indonesia. And so now one of the things that, and this is where I want to talk about going into my question of movement, and then I will close. Oh, there was a thing that does that. Oh, thank you. On movement. I've been interested in this idea of movement then, and to be moved, to be touched. In this last part of the presentation, I want to explore more nearly what I believe to be arts or museums' role that make us move. For this work, I'm inspired by scholars working, for example, in theories of affect, thinking about feelings and the emotional work that exhibitions do to bring us, for example, to tears. What does it mean to be moved by an object or a work of art? For my part, I always give the story about Vermeer and seeing my first Vermeer. And funnily enough, I think I saw my first Vermeer at the Royal Palace in England, meeting the Queen. So it was a kind of complex relationship between me and Vermeer. And I've been shaken by the fact that I was so shaken by seeing Vermeer. Was it because it was a part of the masterpiece of our art history? Or was it because of Vermeer's quality? I'm not so sure yet, but there's part of me that feels that my movement, what moved me in terms of this Vermeer, was the profound understanding that having grown up in the backwaters of empire, I had learned an art history that placed Vermeer as one of the pinnacles of art that was supposed to be important for me. In all of my books, he was there. I had learned that, like Shakespeare, all of my education was brokered through that understanding of what art was. Perhaps, to be honest, what affected me most when I saw the work was like what my son keeps saying about the Mona Lisa. He says, "Daddy, it is very small." The emotions is probably, is that it? But not. To be honest, I am convinced that some works move us. That they move us not just to tears, but they move us in how we understand and constitute an understanding of what the world is. And it is for this reason, that different idea of to move, that I was very much against that battle space when ICOM was trying to get a new definition. Because when they were trying to get the new definition, almost everybody I spoke to who felt that it was too activist, the interim definition, but they didn't want to say it was too activist. They said, but it doesn't have entertainment anymore. Okay. I don't know any curator in here who wouldn't want their exhibition to be a little bit entertaining. And I don't mean like television entertaining, but you want to do something. So it wasn't that. They were afraid that the new museum definition would require that the museum moves us, that it shakes us, that it probably turns all of us into decolonial activists. And that was the fear. And yet being moved, when I look at Hervoni, I'm interested more, as I said to you, in the tectonics of movement. I come from a space in the Caribbean that has had a long relationship with earthquakes. So it is not for nothing that I'm speaking about this. And I speak about this also honoring the earth and what that might mean. But I'm interested in what it means, not only as an affective category that interpolates us, that says, Wayne, look at this, I recognize you in this. But rather, when as a tectonic category, it moves me epistemologically. It shakes my understanding of what modern art can look like, contemporary art can look like. It shapes the very way, shake up the very way that we've come to believe in the ethnographic, that the contemporary, the modern, and tradition cannot exist in the same temporal moment. That tradition dies and contemporary is now. I'm interested in a kind of tectonic movement that will push an ontological shift. A shift that suggests that there are multiple ways of being in the world. I'm interested in listening to the voices, to the life worlds, to the works of indigenous artists who have been telling us for a long time that other worlds are possible, that other worlds exist, that we inhabit a world of many worlds. I'm interested in the ontological because I'm interested in the tectonical, because I'm interested to ask what happens when two epistemologies meet and rub over each other as tectonic shifts do. What is shaken up? When do we dance a little bit? And so I'm interested in the work of some artists who I think have moved me recently. And I'm not necessarily going to go into details into these works, but for example, very important to me is Celia Cunha's work more recently, and her two articulations, this idea of art was a struggle to create a new reality, not to create works for a museum. And the second one, to think of a social movement that changes the order of the world. That, for me, might be the work that we need to do. And I'm sure that you here in this museum have already been doing this. You have been working a lot with indigenous and indigeneity for a much longer, or a long time, an indigenous contemporary living artist for a longer time than we ever would. One of the things that frightens me, and again, is that in the renovation of our Leiden Museum, we are hoping to open a space for an active and dynamic space for contemporary indigenous arts from across the world. Because I don't see that very often in European museums. And the modern art museums and contemporary art museums aren't doing them. It is the one-off. I'm interested in creating that space that is not ethnographic nor art, but it is that space where revolution is possible. So this was Vicunia's work, which was one of the works that was interesting for me. But I wanted to go to Archie Moore, and I'm going to close soon, Archie Moore's work. Just because this was, for me, if it had not won at the Venice Biennale, I would have protested. Because once I walked into this, I was shattered. You all know this work. A structure of dense and seemingly, I quote from an article that I'm writing with friends, white chalk drawings covered the black walls and ceilings draws visitors into Archie Moore's Venice Biennale installation, Kith and Kin. Looking closer, the drawings reveal themselves to be a family tree. It is on reading the text that we know that it is something else, a visualization of the artist's Aboriginal relations from Kamilaruri nation. The diagrams consist of rounded boxes interconnected through drawn lines. As they approach the sky, they seem to form a boundless constellation. In this work, we argue, Moore invites what we called a worlding, an operation that invites us to reimagine what the world is and could become. An idea of tracing a sort of kinship going back so many years. And it isn't one, which is one of the things that fascinates me, that pushes out the question of the colonial, because in the middle there are the colonial archives. And Moore also uses words that one could suggest are themselves emerged out of the colonial infrastructure. In a way, for me, Moore is committed to an understanding of how one contends with the colonial while imagining kinship, kith, friendships, while imagining a different kind of relations in the world. This, for us, in this work that we're writing, is what we call about a temporal and a spatial worlding, which is the kind of move that I'm interested in. So it is in this work, but I will close by saying that it is also in the everyday interactions that we have tried to organize in our museum. So in 2020, in next year, we're going to start the renovation of our museum in Leiden. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to think about how to invite Indigenous voices in that project. What do we do to ensure that Indigenous voices are a part of how we narrate the story? And this here is the image from what we call a young Indigenous person's winter school. So what we are doing every year, hopefully, is that we invite young people from all over, and we said to them that we realize that in Europe, the discussion about restitution is shaped by the state and by curators. We want you to be a part of shaping what restitution might look like. So this year we invited 10 young people from Rapa Nui, Tahiti, South Africa, Kenya, Suriname, and over 2 weeks Canada and the US, over 2 weeks, we were engaged in a conversation about what is the restitutionary movement? What should it look like? What are the questions that we need to ask? One of the things that emerged out of this was the last movement that I'd like to close with. And this here is our most recent restitution. On this side is the restitution of what are called the Benin bronzes. So we restituted the Benin bronzes to Nigeria, 119 of them last June. And to be honest with you, the Benin bronzes are loud. By loud, I mean, when you talk about restitution, everybody says Benin bronze. But that restitution on the other side, and I share this privately, to Isleta del Sur, Pueblo community, was for me one of the most moving that we've done. And it was moving for a number of reasons. One, that object came to us in the late 1800s, and it was bought by an anthropologist, and that's what I say, that it is good to keep these categories. It was bought by an anthropologist, a Dutch anthropologist, but almost at the moment when it was bought, the person from whom it was bought said, I should not have sold it. Also because he should not have sold it. It's not his property. But the Dutch anthropologist literally says that he basically found a way to take it. And in a conversation around its return, which it happened, I think it was also in June that this happened, we managed to return the seven objects, or 6 objects, and the drum. What was moving was when one of the members said to me that for almost 140 years, the people in my community have never been able to do the dance because the drum has not been here. Nobody in my generation, he says, has been able to do this. Finally. Now, as a museum director, as a person, as a curator, as all of those things, I've come to ask the question in a certain kind of Jesus mode. Take this burden from me, please. Because sometimes I wonder, how do I get responsible for these historical pasts? But more than that emotional movement was when we realized, not only with the drum, but similar to the young woman there from Tahiti who said to us, this is not an object. Your entire category in your database needs to change. This has personhood. It is an ancestor. And then, this is what I mean by move. What might it mean that we as museums must contend with putting away those categories of the past, those ways of knowing and being that we are so stubborn about in the past, that would seek to preserve objects rather than caring for life. I'm interested in the tectonic movement that would see our museums no longer use words like preservation, but be committed to life and to care for people, for planet, for skills. At the end of the day, I'm not suggesting that we disappear our museums. Many people think that we should get rid of them, whatever. I'm not one of those. It's probably because I want to keep my job. No, but at the end of the day, I've been interested in a concept I call suturing. How do we suture wounds? Suture the wounds, the historical injustices. in ways that do not hide those wounds. One can think of the kitsugi, but rather make bare the wounds of the past as we try to imagine what a different, more equitable and just world might look like. This is what I think indigenous arts across borders could help us do. And it is not a burden on indigenous peoples. It is a burden on museums to be complicit in creating the world that all of us can inhabit equitably. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. We're going to save questions for Wayne to a little bit later when he's on a panel, so that way everyone has an opportunity to take, I guess the current term is a bio break, and if you want to restock on coffee, but please.